Okay, 4.2 is about applying congruence in triangles. Congruent means that figures have the same shape and the same size. We talked about this briefly before. We're going to get into a lot more details in this chapter. This is the symbol for congruence. It has an equal sign with a little wavy line above it. And again, that means that they are the same shape and the same size. When two figures are congruent, the corresponding angles are congruent and the corresponding sides are congruent. The term corresponding is important to understand. I'm going to talk about that with our first example. So looking at my brown example here, we have two triangles, ABC and DEF. This statement is important. It tells us that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Because I know that they are congruent, I know all the corresponding parts are congruent. That's what all of these statements are here. That's important that you see that. Because I know this, then I know this. These are corresponding parts. A and D are corresponding. Because I know that the triangles are congruent, I know that those corresponding parts are congruent. Look where A and D are. A and D are corresponding because they're in the same location, which means they're congruent because the triangles are congruent. I can look at the picture, but sometimes the picture is a little bit more complicated. So you may want to look here. A and D are corresponding angles and congruent. B and E are corresponding and congruent. Angles C and F are corresponding and congruent, and that's where this came from. Same thing with sides. A, B, and D, E. You can look at the picture because this one's rather simple. It's not always going to be that way. A, B, and D, E. You can also use this statement. A, B, D, E are sides that are corresponding and congruent. B, C, E, F. They're corresponding and congruent. If you can see down here is the same thing. And the last one, C, A, F, D, corresponding and congruent. That's important. So again, because I know the triangles are congruent, I know all the parts are congruent. In order to prove to go backwards, if I want to know if they're congruent, I have to know all of this is true in order to say this is true. So I have to know all the corresponding sides are congruent, all the corresponding angles are congruent, therefore I can say the triangles are congruent. So that works both ways. Let's look at an example. So we're asked to write a congruent statement if the figures are congruent. So we have to decide if they are congruent in order to write a congruent statement. So in order to show that they're congruent, we need to know all corresponding sides are congruent, all corresponding angles are congruent. Let's look at sides first. We have this triangle here and this triangle here. I see these two sides are congruent, these two sides are congruent, and GE is reflexive. It's part of both of those triangles, so I can say it's congruent to itself. All corresponding sides are congruent. Now angles. D and F, those are marked as 90. They're congruent. This angle G here and this angle E is congruent. This angle G here and this angle is also congruent. So all corresponding angles are congruent and all corresponding sides are congruent. Now it gets a little bit tricky to write this statement. You cannot write them in any order. The order is important because this order indicates that D and F are corresponding and congruent. You can see D and F are my 90-degree angles. There's several different ways you can write this statement and make it correct. And make sure you go in the same order. Look how I did mine, DEG. I started at the 90, went across the 2 marking, and ended at G. My second one, I started at the 90, I went across the 2 marking, and ended at E. So follow that same pattern. It would have been incorrect to do DEG and FEG. Notice how I would have gone incorrectly to the 1 markings instead of the 2. So you could have marked this as GED and EGF, that would have been fine, as long as you're following that same order. So this is our congruent statement. I'm allowed to write this because all of the corresponding parts are congruent. Look at example 2. I have 2 figures. I have to decide if these 2 figures are congruent. You can see that the angles are good. These angles are the same. These angles are the same. These angles are the same. So all corresponding angles are congruent. Corresponding sides must also be congruent, and that is not the case. These three sides are congruent. These three sides are congruent. But I do not know that corresponding sides are congruent. These two aren't congruent. These two are not. These two are not. So I do not know that those triangles are congruent. To fix it, it would look more like this. Congruent, congruent, congruent. Then it could have said, we could say that those triangles are congruent. So because the corresponding sides are not congruent, this triangle is not congruent. One more new idea for today, third angles theorem. It says if two angles of one triangle are congruent to two angles of another, then the third angles are also congruent. If you look at my picture, that should make sense. These two angles are congruent. You can see that with the markings. These two are congruent. Well, we know that triangles have to add up to 180. So if we already have a 60 and a 70, this one has to be congruent in order to be a triangle. So if you have two sets of angles that are congruent, the third are also going to be congruent. This is going to be helpful when we look at some proofs this chapter. With this example, they're asking you to find x. We're going to use this third angles theorem. Congruent, congruent. That tells me that this other angle must also be congruent. Third angles theorem allows us to say that. So we can set up our equation because I know that the second marking is 70. So this is 70. 70 plus 2x plus 60 equals 180. This is in a different order, but that doesn't matter. Then when you solve it, you find x is 25. The reason why I'm allowed to move that 70 over is really because of the markings. And we know that it has to add up to 180. One more example. It says find x and y. We have to figure out what lines up so that we can figure out our equation. So if you look, angle C and angle D, I know that my picture doesn't reflect this, but angles C and D have the same markings, so those are congruent. That's where this equation came from. 1/2 x plus 1 equals 31. The markings say they're congruent. Set up our equation and solve it, and x is 60. My other markings, so it does tell us that 2y minus 3 and 129 are the same. I think I neglected to do this. These two should be the same. So because this one's congruent, then these two angles must be congruent, and that's where this equation came from. So 2y minus 3 equals 129. They're corresponding angles, which means they're congruent. Set up my equation and solved y equals 66. The biggest thing you need to be careful of is making sure that you have the angles set up appropriately according to the corresponding parts. So D and C are corresponding, F and A are corresponding, and E and B are corresponding, which means they would be congruent. As always, guys, I'll answer questions before you take a quiz on this when I see you on Monday the 8th. And here's your homework to do. Please let me know if you have any questions on that. And again, I'll answer questions on Monday.